Joining us once again is economist Dean Baker. He is the co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. His areas of research include housing and macroeconomics, intellectual property, and entitlements, as they are now called by some. He is the author of a number of books, including The End of Loser Liberalism, Making Markets Progressive, and he is the author of, among other things, a recent op-ed on the Trans-Pacific Partnership called Fools or Liars on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Dean, thanks for joining us.
Sure, thanks a lot for having me on.
Oh, always a pleasure. Listen, so about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what prompted you? You've been one of the strongest voices criticizing this deal, pointing out the flaws in it. What prompted you to write this piece this week?
Well, two things. First off, there's been a proliferation of columns, editorials, saying how great the Trans-Pacific Partnership is, which I felt need to respond to, but also presumably that's because the Obama administration is planning to put it before Congress soon. It's they often do that. They'll talk to their allies and say, hey, could you try to build some support for that? So it seems like it's coming to a head. So that was part of it. But the specific thing, fools and liars, what really got me, I'm used to, all is fair in love, war, and trade debates. One of the things that I mentioned in there that has been being touted all over the place, that they're going to eliminate 18,000 tariffs on U.S. exports. And, they're running around, all these people are saying that, like, wow, 18,000 tariffs. And you go, like, what are you guys talking about? And Public Citizen did the footwork. They looked it up, and they go, okay, what are these tariffs? And it turns out that more than half of them, we don't even export anything in these categories. And some of them are like things that they're environmentally, like there's apparently a Japanese tariff on whale meat. Well, we're going to be exporting whale meat. Burmese tariff, not Burmese, Malaysian tariff on shark fins. So this is just silliness. And, the vast majority of them were very minor categories, like Brunei apparently has a tariff on ski boots. Not
right.
People, So anyhow,
right. And Brunei, for people who don't know it, there's not a lot of skiing that goes on there. Also, by the way, I can't resist throwing in, Dean, that they also found that one of the tariffs being lifted is Christmas ornaments and pork for Malaysia and Brunei, which are both Muslim nations. Camels for Vietnam, by the way, is another one. You can sell your camel in Vietnam if this deal goes through.
Yeah, so this is just kind of silliness. This is not helping have a serious debate on the trade agreement, and so that's why I was the fools and liars. When you said this, the columnists, the people who repeat this, the politicians who repeat this, do they not have a clue? Are they just running around, or do they know that we're removing the tariff on camels? And it's just the sort of thing. As I said, this crops up all the time in trade deals. And I just thought they really needed to be called out on this because it's just obviously totally dishonest from the word go.
Well, and going from the dishonesty to the kind of macro picture, or perhaps a different form of dishonesty, you'll tell me, but you point out that the Peter Peterson Institute for International Economics, which is reliably pro TPP, pro this kind of deal, and this deal in particular, produced a study showing that that this agreement will supposedly add 0.5 percentage point to the GDP when its effects are fully felt. What does that really mean?
Well, a couple things. First off, just to understand 0.5 percentage point GDP, they're touting this. They more often put the number, and I think it comes to like $100 billion because they're talking about 2030. We'll, of course, have a higher GDP in 2030 than we do today. And that sounds like a lot of money. So they've been touting this going, oh, my God. Well, the economy grows, and 0.5% GDP means that, we'd be roughly, assuming this were exactly right, and I'm going to come to that in a second, but if we say, okay, let's say your amount is exactly right, it means that on January 1st, 2030, we'll be as rich as we would have otherwise have been on March 15th, 2030. So that's not zero, but it's a little hard to get all that excited about that.
Right.
But the other part of the story is that they quite explicitly assume, and they say this, this is a standard in the models, but I really appreciate the fact that they were honest about this. They quite explicitly assume that the trade agreement has no impact on employment, has no impact on the trade deficit, that those are unaffected by the trade deal. So that's in the model. So when they say it won't create unemployment, well, Their model doesn't tell us anything about that. It's constructed. The way it's constructed, it can't possibly show that it will create unemployment.
Well, I guess two things that strike me about that, and we're talking with economist Dean Baker about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Number one is, in other words, their assumption is that the effects of this trade deal will be nothing like the effects of all the previous trade deals, right? In other words, they're throwing out, aren't they throwing out the experience we've now had for 20 plus years of how these trade deals do, in fact, impact both employment and deficits in order to make that assumption?
Well, let me put this way, and I'll be as generous as I can to them. We go back, we look at NAFTA. There's a big increase in the U.S. trade deficit with Mexico post-NAFTA. We go to the permanent normal trading relations with China. Big increase in U.S. trade deficit with China following that. You go to Korea. Big increase with the U.S. trade deficit in Korea following the trade deals. Now, did the trade deals cause that increase? Arguable point. I certainly think that was a factor. But in any case, the reality was in all three of those cases, and we can go back down the list, those are three most prominent. That is why I selected them. But in any case, in those three cases, we clearly had large increases in the trade deficit. And if you're going to say, okay, what's been the result of our trade with China over the last 2 decades, you would have to say we've had a lot of unemployment. And they've ruled that out in their analysis of this. So insofar as this deal could end up leading to more unemployment, they aren't analyzing that because by assumption they've ruled that out.
So, and, I guess the second point I was going to make about that, Dean, was that given the what seems to me the audacity of that assumption, as I understand it, it seems that half a percentage point is an extremely low number for them to have come up with, having stacked the deck so heavily in the deal's favor.
Well, the reality, and again, if we're being honest about the reality, is it doesn't actually do that much on trade, and that's simply because we already have trade deals with most of these countries. So, Canada is one of the parties to the agreement, Mexico, Chile, Australia. These are all countries we already have trade deals, and you look at the ones that we don't. Japan, we already have a huge amount of trade with Japan, and the barriers, the formal trade barriers, are actually fairly low. So it's not as though there's huge tariffs that will be lifted with Japan. So it's not a surprise that they actually don't come up with much, because if you're looking at, okay, so we're going to make, take the few barriers that still exist and make a 1% barrier zero, it's not going to have too much effect. So the reality is, as I say, it's not really about trade. If you just looked at the trade aspects of it, that really wouldn't be a big deal. This is about regulations, and it's about putting in a structure, to my view, of very pro-business regulations, which, again, my view is like, why do we want to do that?
And this includes, when you say that, you're including things like the international settlement dispute, the extrajudicial arbitration hearings that it calls for, that allows foreign corporations to sue the U.S. government or U.S. governments, vice versa, to sue U.S. corporations to sue other governments for laws and deals that might impact their profitability, even environmental protection, things like that.
Exactly, and this is one of these things that, again, it's almost too incredible to believe. I mean, the first person who told me about it, I didn't believe them just because it sounded too wacky. But it creates these investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. They're actually part of other trade deals, so this isn't the first time they've come into existence. But it expands their role enormously. And what it means is that any time a foreign investor in the U.S., and this could be a U.S. foreign subsidiary of a U.S. company, so General Electric could have a foreign subsidiary that wants to do business in the U.S. and there's some environmental law, labor law, health and safety law they don't like, say a ban on fracking. They could take that to these investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, and the way that would work is that the U.S. would get to appoint one person, and important to keep out, this is whatever administration would appoint one person. Many of these laws might be state or local laws, so you may have a law in California that maybe a Trump administration isn't that fond of. I shouldn't say that. We don't want to think about such things, but in any case, you could have an administration that may not be sympathetic to a state or local law. So they appoint one. Investment, the foreign company or subsidiary that's bringing the suit appoints one, and they jointly appoint the third person. And this tribunal is not bound by precedent, so it's not like our traditional legal proceeding where they go, well, the Supreme Court said X, Y, and Z. They look at it. Presumably they'll look at precedents, but they're not bound by them, and there's no appeal. So if for whatever reason they make a really erratic ruling, too bad. So you go, well, we have a pretty well-developed legal system. Do we really want to say that we're just going to discard it because, we want to have this trade deal? And, to my mind, it's pretty crazy. And if you talk to the people who are supporters, what they say is, okay, no one's going to say businesses don't get a fair shake in U.S. legal system.
Right.
That's just silly. So what they say is, well, it's true they get a fair shake in the U.S. legal system. You look at the other countries, certainly Canada, Australia, maybe not in Vietnam. I don't know. Vietnam has an incentive to treat businesses fairly because if they don't, then no business will invest there. But let's say they can't trust Vietnam. You go, okay, so why do we have to create this whole legal system, extrajudicial process for the United States to make it easier for firms to invest in Vietnam? You could invest there, take a risk. You don't trust your legal system. Well, you expect a higher return, and you typically get it. So it seems to me just a very, very strange apparatus to set up just so that, in this case, the 2, 3, 4 countries that we might think have questionable legal systems that, will give our companies more assurances that they don't have to worry about arbitrary treatment.
Yeah, I guess it's strange from a public policy perspective. It's not so strange if you're lobbying on behalf of multinational corporations, then it seems like a very useful mechanism to put in place. Or am I being too cynical?
No, well, I think that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, I'm trying to be as generous as possible. You go, okay, why do you guys want this? And, this is their argument. I mean, no one stands up with a straight face. They might think they're not being treated as, quote, fairly as they would like to be in U.S. courts. But no business wants to get up with a straight face, say, oh, we can't trust, the courts to rule fairly when it's an issue of environmental regulation or worker safety or whatever. They can't. They won't say that because it's just ridiculous. So what they fall back on is, well, sure, U.S. is fine, Australia is fine, but we don't know about Vietnam. And again, just take them at face value. You go, well, fine, but then just suck it up. If you don't trust Vietnam, then tell them you don't invest there unless you can be sure of a higher rate of return, and that's the way it goes.
Well, it makes complete sense to me, but then again, I'm more of a cynic, or at least I'm adopting more of a cynical posture today, and just assuming that, this is the creature of lobbying. But then I guess that's not unfair of me, given that many, many lobbyists got a chance to take a look at the draft of this agreement, as I understand it, before the public did.
Well, it's more than just they took a look at it. They were in on the negotiation. So you had these working groups that were, as it went along, they were working out chapters and, sitting down at the table with their counterparts in other countries. And they're saying, okay, we want this, we don't want that. So they had very direct voice into the process. So it wasn't just that they looked at it. They had very, very direct voice into the process. And it was kept secret until, I think it was, I'm trying to think, it was in the fall that, it was signed, President Obama and the other leaders signed it. And at that point, it was finally made public. But the whole process, it was negotiated in secret. Congress voted on the fast-track authority, so it's a straight up or down vote without amendment, without filibuster. They voted on that without having seen any part of it. Well, I shouldn't say that. Members of Congress had access to it, but it was very limited access. Their aides generally did not have access to it, and, of course, the general public did not. So if, a particular member of Congress wasn't an expert on the intellectual property rules, the patent or copyright rules, or the environmental chapter, they had to rely. They could make comments to people and ask questions, but they couldn't actually bring a text to say an expert on environmental law. What does this mean? They weren't able to do that.
Right. I think I spoke to Alan Grayson, member of the House, and he said they went in. They were allowed to go in without their aides present and bring a notepad and maybe write a few things down, but they couldn't make any copies. They could not have it sent to their office. They had to go to a special location. So yes, this has not been exactly a democratic and transparent process. So, okay. Well, I appreciate, Dean Baker, you coming on and talking about this deal with us, and I appreciate the generosity of spirit with which you've entered into this exercise, but it seems to me the conclusions are inescapable.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a business deal. I mean, the people negotiating it were overwhelmingly represented as a business. The people had input into the process, and again, you go, what does the American public stand to gain? The typical worker, typical consumer versus what the businesses who were in on the process. I don't think there's any doubt. The businesses stand to gain here a lot, and I think it puts everyone else at a lot of risk. And just to be very concrete about that, in terms of the environmental regulation or health and safety regulation, New York State is a ban on fracking. So, that is something that could be contested through the ISDS. And, I have no idea. Maybe they just go, yeah, that's fine. They're doing it. They aren't trying to discriminate against foreign companies. They're doing that because they're concerned about drinking water. But they may say, well, their evidence isn't that good, and, there are these foreign companies that did buy land with the hope that they would be able to frack on it. And, if New York State, and again, this is one of the things that people play games with, they go, they can't overturn the law. That's absolutely right. They just tell New York State, fine, you want to keep this anti-fracking law, that's fine. You just have to pay a penalty of $1 billion a year.
Right. Which would mean, of course, and for practical terms, they might have to overthrow it. And of course, it's not just fracking. People have said that the Dodd-Frank regulations on Wall Street might be challenged. The consumer protections have been challenged, and/or could be challenged by this process. So it's really a privatizing of, I would argue, of our judicial function.
It is, and this is one of these things. Not to be the big patriot here, but I think we have a pretty good legal system, which doesn't mean I'll agree everything that Supreme Court rules and everything. But we've built it up over 200 years, and in terms of being reasonably good at offering a semblance of justice. I understand black people tend not to get treated well, poor people, but still, the basic structure is, I think, very good. And just to say we're going to throw that out, instead have this private system that operates by a whole different set of rules, and in some way no rules, because again, it isn't subject to appeal, and we do get weird people who sit on the bench, so there's certainly reason to think every now and then you're going to get weird people sitting there as members of these tribunals. How could that not happen?
Right.
And they make a really bad ruling, and in our court system go, okay, so we got some buffoon that made a stupid ruling. We'll bring it up to the next level, and they're going to throw it out. And that is what happens. But in this case, no. End of story.
No, absolutely not. And so some of us will keep fighting this treaty as long as we can. Well, Dean Baker, economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks a lot for having me on.